boys and girls. In this video, we're going to take a look at another way to write numbers as parts of a whole. You notice behind me I have a place value chart. You all should be familiar with this place value chart. You've been looking at it for most of the year. We have been working all this year so far to the left of this point called our decimal point. This is our whole number side. Today, we're going to take a look at the decimal side, or to the right of our decimal point. That's where we use those places to represent parts of a whole, numbers that are part of a whole. And we have another way that we've already learned how to write parts of a whole, and that's called a fraction. So we're going to look at how decimals might be related to fractions. So let me get my first example up. Here's my first example that I have for you. Notice this is my place value block, and in this case, I am saying this place value block represents one whole. I have the whole thing colored in. Now, I happen to have divided my whole into 10 parts because, again, our place value system is based on the number 10. So 10 parts out of 10 is equal to one whole. Now, I use the same place value block here, but notice I only shaded in 5 of my 10 parts. So now I don't have one whole, I have 5 out of 10, or another way to read this fraction is 5/10. Notice I put the 5 in my tenths place, and the way that I read this decimal, 5/10 is equivalent to the way that I read this fraction, 5/10. So already we see a relationship between fractions and decimals. My denominator has to be 10 for any number that sits in my tenths place. Let's look at my next example. Now I've used a different model to represent one whole. This model is divided into 100 equal parts. It's almost like if you think about money, like 100 pennies equal $1. So I have 100 parts here. That represents my one whole. And now I want to look at part of my one whole. So I've drawn the same model, only this time I've shaded in only 25 out of the 100 parts. So I have 25 out of my 100 parts that represented my one whole. 25 hundredths, and again, we know how to write that as a fraction. $25 hundredths is equivalent to my decimal number, 0.25. And when we read our decimal numbers, we don't usually say point. We would read it as 25 in the hundredths place, 25 hundredths. So we see, again, decimal, fraction, equivalent. Now, let's do another example. If I have 8 out of 10, how could I write that as a decimal number? Well, I'm going to have my decimal point, and I want 8 in the tenths place. So I'm going to have my decimal point, 8 in my tenths place, it would be 0.8 is how I would write 8/10 my fraction and 8/10 my decimal. Now, we don't read this number 0.8. We read it as 8/10. Okay, another example. Let's do a hundredths number. And I'm going to get a little tricky here. So what about 6/100? How would I write that decimal number? Well, I know 6 has to be in my hundredths place. So I have my decimal. Now, what am I going to put in my tenths place? Well, I don't have anything to put there. So what is that? 0 is my hero. 0. And then 6 is going into my hundredths place. So 6/100, 6 in the hundredths place. That's how I would read that decimal number. Now, notice to relate decimals and fractions, I have to have a denominator of 10 for tenths or a denominator of 100 for hundredths. So is there a way that we can convert some of our common fractions into decimal numbers? Well, let's take a look at our most common fraction. Our most common fraction is 1/2. How can I write 1/2 so that it has a 10 or 100 in the denominator? Well, now we're going to draw on our knowledge about equivalent fractions. So what do I have to multiply 1/2 by to end up with 10 in the denominator? I know I can multiply 1/2 times 5/5, and that gives me 5/10. And we already saw before how to write 5/10 as a decimal. So we know that 5/10 is also equal to my fraction 1/2. Now, let's expand this even further. That means that all of my 1/2 fractions can be written as the same decimal number. And that decimal number is 0.5 or 5/10. I hope this video clears up a little bit of misunderstanding you might have about decimals. They're not as hard as you think. And next, we're going to look at more converting of fraction numbers to decimals.